ELOFF's determined attack on Mafeking, and the relief of the town the Mafeking Fund War. War is still the cry, war even to the knife. BYRON. The Boers are in the stadt. Such was the ominous message that was quickly passed round from mouth to mouth on Saturday morning, May 12, 1900, as day was breaking. One had to be well acquainted with the labyrinth of rocks, trees, huts and cover generally, of the locality aforementioned, all within a stone's throw of our dwelling, to realise the dread import of these words. All the previous week things had been much as usual, inferior food and very little of it, divine weather, bridge in the afternoons, and one day exactly like another. Since the departure of the big gun during the previous month, we had left our bomb-proofs and lived above ground. In the early hours of the morning alluded to came the real event we had been expecting ever since the beginning of the siege, namely, a Boer attack under cover of darkness. The moon had just set, and it was pitch dark. A fierce fusillade first began from the east, and when I opened the door on to the stoop the din was terrific, while swish, swish, came the bullets just beyond the canvas blinds, nailed to the edge of the veranda to keep off the sun. Now and then the boom of a small gun varied the noise, but the rifles never ceased for an instant. To this awe-inspiring tune I dressed, by the light of a carefully shaded candle, to avoid giving any mark for our foes. The firing never abated, and I had a sort of idea that any moment a Dutchman would look in at the door, for one could not tell from what side the real attack might be. In various stages of decibel people were running round the house seeking for rifles, fowling pieces and even sticks, as weapons of defence. Meanwhile the gloom was still unbroken, but for the starlight, and it was very cold. The Cockney waiter, who was such a fund of amusement to me, had dashed off with his rifle to his redoubt, taking the keys of the house in his pocket, so no one could get into the dining room to have coffee, except through the kitchen window. The 2 hours of darkness that had to elapse were the longest I have ever spent. Hurried footsteps passed to and fro, dark lanterns flashed for an instant, intensifying the blackness, and all of a sudden the sound I had been waiting for added to the weird horror of the situation. An alarm bugle, winding out its tale, clear and true to the farthest byways and the most remote shanties, followed by our tocsin, the deep-toned Roman Catholic church bell, which was the signal that a general attack was in progress. We caught dim glimpses of the town guard going to their appointed places in the most orderly manner, and I remember thinking that where there was no panic there could be but little danger. An officer of this guard came down the road and told us all his men had turned out without exception, including an old fellow of 70, and stone-deaf, who had been roused by the rifle fire, and one minus several fingers recently blown off by a shell. I went out to the front of the house facing the stadt, and therefore sheltered from the hail of bullets coming from the east, and just as we were noticing that objects could be discerned on the road, that before were invisible, forked tongues of lurid light shot up into the sky in the direction where, snug and low by the Malopo River, lay the natives' habitations. Even then one did not realize what was burning, and someone said, "What a big grass fire. It must have commenced yesterday." At the same moment faint cries, unmistakable for Kaffir ejaculations, were borne to us by the breeze, along with the smell of burning thatch and wood, and the dread sentence with which I commenced this chapter seemed to grow in volume, till to one's excited fancy it became a sort of chant, to which the yells of the blacks, the unceasing rattle of musketry, formed an unholy accompaniment. "Hark, what is that?" was a universal exclamation from the few folk, mostly women, standing in front of Mr. Wiles' house, as a curious hoarse cheer arose not in the stadt, half a mile away, but nearer, close by, only the other side of the station, where was situated the BSAP fort, the headquarters of the officer commanding the Protectorate Regiment. This so-called fort was in reality an obsolete old work of the time of Sir Charles Warren's 1884 expedition, and was but slightly fortified. The Boers, after setting fire to the stadt, had rushed it, surprising the occupants, and the horrible noise of their cheering arose again and again. Then a terrific fusillade broke out from this new direction, rendering the roadway a place of the greatest danger. My quarters were evidently getting too hot, and I knew that Wiles' house and store would be the first objective of the Boers. I bethought me even novices might be useful in the hospital, so I decided to proceed there in one way or another. Although the rifle fire was slackening towards the east, from the fort on the west it was continuing unabated, and the way to the hospital lay through the most open part of the town. Calling to our soldier servant of the Royal Horse Guards to accompany me, I snatched up a few things of value and started off. "You will be shot, to a certainty," said Mr. Weil. But it was no use waiting, as one could not tell what would happen next. The bullets were fortunately flying high. All the same, we had twice to stop under a wall and wait for a lull before proceeding. Then I saw a native boy fall in front of me, and at the same moment I stumbled and fell heavily, the servant thinking I was hit. And all the while we could hear frightened cries continuing to emanate from the flaming stadt. The day had fully broken, and never had the roads appeared so white and wide, the sheltering houses so few and far between. At length we reached the hospital trench, and the last 500 yards of the journey were accomplished in perfect safety. My dangerous experiences ended for the rest of that dreadful day, which I spent in the haven of those walls, sheltering so much suffering, and that were, alas, by evening crammed to their fullest capacity. It was a gruesome sight seeing the wounded brought in, and the blood-stained stretchers carried away empty, when the occupants had been deposited in the operating room. Sometimes an ambulance wagon would arrive with 4 or 5 inmates. At others we descried a stretcher party, moving cautiously across the recreation ground towards us with a melancholy load. It is easy to imagine our feelings of dread and anxiety as we scanned the features of the new arrivals, never knowing who might be the next. During the morning, 3 wounded Boers were brought in, the first prisoners Mafeking could claim, then a native with his arm shattered to the shoulder. All were skillfully and carefully attended to by the army surgeon and his staff in a marvellously short space of time, and comfortably installed in bed. But the Boers begged not to have sheets, as they had never seen such things before. Among the English casualties, one case was a very sad one. A young man named Hazelrig of an old Leicestershire family was badly shot in the region of the heart when taking a message to the BSAP fort, not knowing the Boers were in possession. Smart and good-looking, he had only just been promoted to the post of orderly from being a private in the Cape Police, into which corps he had previously enlisted, having failed in his army examination. When brought to the hospital, Hazelrig had nearly bled to death and was dreadfully weak, his case being evidently hopeless. I sat with him several hours, putting eau de cologne on his head and brushing away the flies. In the evening, just before he passed into unconsciousness, he repeated more than once, "Tell the Colonel, Lady Sarah, I did my best to give the message, but they got me first." He died at dawn. All through the weary hours of that perfect summer's day the rifles never ceased firing. Sometimes a regular fusillade for 10 minutes or so. Then, as if tired out, sinking down to a few single shots, while the siren-like whistle and sharp explosion of the shells from the high-velocity gun continued intermittently and added to the dangers of the streets. So the hours dragged on. All the time the wildest rumours pervaded the air. Now the Boers had possession of the whole stadt. Again, as soon as night fell, large reinforcements were to force their way in. Of course we knew the Colonel was all the while maturing his plans to rid the town of the unbidden guests, but what these were no one could tell. About 8 p.m., when we were in the depth of despair, we got an official message to say that the Boers in the stadt had been surrounded and taken prisoners, and also that the fort had surrendered to Colonel Hoare, who, with some of his officers, had been all day in the curious position of captives in their own barracks. Of course our delight and thankfulness knew no bounds. In spite of the dead and dying patients, those who were slightly wounded or convalescent gave a feeble cheer, which was a pathetic sound. We further heard that the prisoners, in number about 100, including Commandant ELOFF, their leader, were then being marched through the town to the Masonic Hall, followed by a large crowd of jeering and delighted natives. 2 of the nurses and myself ran over to look at them, and I never saw a more motley crew. In the dim light of a few oil lamps they represented many nationalities, the greater part laughing, joking, and even singing, the burghers holding themselves somewhat aloof, but the whole community giving one the idea of a body of men who knew they had got out of a tight place, and were devoutly thankful still to have whole skins. ELOFF and 3 principal officers were accommodated at Mr. Wile's house, having previously dined with the Colonel and staff. At 6 a.m. Sunday morning we were awakened by 3 shells bursting close by, one after the other. I believe no one was more frightened than ELOFF, but he told us that it was a preconcerted signal, and that if they had been in possession of the town, they were to have answered by rifle fire when the Boers would have marched in. These proved to be the last shells that were fired into Mafeking. The same morning at breakfast I sat opposite to Commandant ELOFF, who was the president's grandson, and had on my right a most polite French officer, who could not speak a word of English, Dutch, or German, so it was difficult to understand how he made himself understood by his then companions in arms. In strong contrast to this affable and courteous gentleman was ELOFF, of whom we had heard so much as a promising Transvaal general. A typical Boer of the modern school, with curiously unkempt hair literally standing on end, light sandy whiskers and a small moustache. He was wearing a sullen and dejected expression on his by no means stupid, but discontented and unprepossessing face. This scion of the Kruger family did not scruple to air his grievances or disclose his plans with regard to the struggle of the previous day. That he was brilliantly assisted by the French and German freelances was as surely demonstrated as the fact of his having been left more or less in the lurch by his countrymen when they saw that to get into Mafeking was one thing, but to stay there or get out of it again was quite a different matter. In a few words he told us in fairly good English how it had been posted up in the laager. "We leave for Mafeking tonight. We will breakfast at Dixon's Hotel tomorrow morning." How he had sent back to instruct Reuters' agent to cable the news that Mafeking had been taken as soon as the fort was in their hands. How he had left his camp with 400